Salutations, everyone! Welcome back to Victoria 3. I'm Lord Formand, and here today we've got a country guide on the Great Qing. Pardon me if I don't get the pronunciation right on some stuff. I'm not Chinese. Anyhow, this video should be divided into several chapters, which you should be able to click on below, and they will help you get to the section you're interested in. So, let's first talk about the starting situation for I'm going to call it China. That way I don't have to keep trying to pronounce the name. Let's talk about the starting situation for China. It is both good and bad. What's good is that you've got both Tibet and Korea under your influence. In fact, if we look at the diplomacy, you've got two tributaries also. You've got Lanfang, which is right down there. Neither Korea nor Lanfang will actually be giving you any amounts of money. And you've also got a tributary in Tibet, which is also relatively useless. Outside of that, you have no allies, and you have one particularly terrifying opponent. So if we move forward a few days here, let's just skip this. You will trigger the Opium Crisis. So the Opium Crisis was a real-life thing. The Han people were becoming addicted to opium. Pretty much, from what I can tell, historically, it was designed to be done by Great Britain and the other European powers. Anyway, it caused a lot of havoc and problems in China. So you'll get this event, and you have two options. You can not risk the ire of Great Britain, or you can we have to do something. Now, the issue with we have to do something is it gives Britain the event Opium Wars. Right now, in my experience, Great Britain doesn't do too much. However, the devs in their recent dev diary have talked about the problem of stuff like this not fully firing and causing trouble. So in the event that this does happen, be aware that this can start a war with Great Britain. And it gives you a horrific penalty for offense, defense, standard of living, and mortality for 5 years. Basically, for 5 years, anybody who invades you is going to have a really good shot at killing you. So you obviously want to avoid that war. Now, when you take that, it will unlock a decision you can do called ban the opium trade. And in fact, to solve the opium crisis, you need to take the decision and hold it for 5 years. So you're going to want to pass it pretty much immediately. It does hurt the ban on authority. The ban does hurt authority, sorry. Once the opium crisis is over, make sure you turn off the ban on opium. First off, it gives you back the authority. And second off, you're going to need opium late game. So banning is a bad decision. You need it for this first aid and field hospitals later on. In fact, you can become one of the world's largest opium producers and make tons of money, which is ironic because at the beginning of the game, it's designed to make tons of money for the Europeans. Outside of that, you have a single province here, Macau, owned by Portugal. None of the other ports controlled by Europeans exist. This is a problem, though, for your later game. It's a treaty port. It's considered part of your homeland. So why is this such a major disaster? Well, if you go down to... Oh, it hasn't shown up yet. Later on, there will be the Boxer Rebellion, and it triggers when you research the society, tech, political agitation, I believe. And basically, if any of your Han Chinese homelands... Han being the dominant population culture in your land. If any of their homelands are owned by another nation, it will start to trigger a disaster. And the reason all this is important is because you have this long-term journal entry called Fragile Unity. Basically, if you lose the Opium Wars, if you fail to stop the Heavenly Kingdom, fail to retake the Heavenly Kingdom, Boxer Rebellion, go to default, have a civil war, become a subject under another country, or abolish the monarchy, you will get 20% towards the fracturing. If for some reason you hit 100, China will absolutely shatter and become, in general, just multiple shattered nations and pretty much ruin your run, since I assume you're playing the China to become the greatest power in the world, which, to be honest, is extraordinarily easy for a human player in China. To get rid of this, well, it's not as straightforward as you would think to get rid of it. The descriptions vary a bit sometimes. Basically, you have to cease to be a unrecognized power and other stuff to reduce this in order to stop it completely. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later when the entry shows up, but suffice to say, you have to deal with the Boxer Rebellion, which is annoying because it actually means you can't retake this treaty port and still have a chance of stopping the unity problems. You also get rid of monarchy and get recognition from a major power. So let's talk a little bit more about those disasters I just mentioned. So obviously, the opium crisis is relatively easy to survive. The Heavenly Kingdom here disaster can be a real problem. If you have a state that any population there has Protestant and it has high turmoil, it will trigger the God-worshipping society. Now, this can be a problem, especially if Great Britain, for example, manages to take a treaty port from you in the Opium Wars and then spread its Protestant religion there, and then for some reason you retake it. It will tend to trigger this disaster. Outside of that, the odds of it firing are pretty low so long as you stay with state religion. It tends to convert people, especially if you later on put on migration controls, which honestly is probably a decent idea to prevent it from firing. Basically, it will prevent discriminated against cultures and religions pops from migrating into your lands. That will prevent that disaster from ever firing. If it does, it'll cause a huge amount of problems. Try to stamp it out as soon as you can. I'll let you enjoy the event chain that involves. The Boxer Rebellion is relatively similar. It fires political agitation, so it doesn't necessarily start early, but you should prepare for it because you need to stop it to solve the fragile unity crisis. Additionally, there are several other events. First off, if you're playing this game, China, in order to complete the egalitarian missions, I'm not showing them here, but they do exist. Basically, you need to abolish the monarchy type stuff, liberalize the country. There's a couple events associated with that. The first one is, once you start abolishing the monarchy, which should take you a good portion of the game, considering how invested the population of China is in their monarch or their emperor, you will trigger two things. First off, you might trigger a revolt, but then additionally, you'll have two other things. You'll have a journal entry pop up called Stamp Out Monarchism. Basically, you have to make sure none of your interest groups that are powerful, that is above 20% influence, have high support for the monarchy. Basically, repress everybody except for repress the rural folk, the landholders, and your religious group. And that tends to solve the problem. So trade unions, intelligentsia, and other parties that are not pro-monarchy are ones you need to support and make sure they're powerful instead. Now, if you do manage to abolish the monarchy, there will be an event called, I forget what it is, the end of the monarchy in China, basically, where you throw out the Manchu emperor from the Forbidden Palace. Now, that can be problematic because it will allow you to choose between two things. One, you can remove Manchu culture. Manchu culture is located up here. The Manchu ruled over China to a large degree at this point. It will allow you to either offend them or offend your main Han population. Any guess which group you should offend? If you guess the Manchu, yeah, it was pretty obvious. Mainly because one's population is like 10 times the other. It will make them immensely radical and can easily cause a revolution or disasters. Be aware that abolishing the monarchy will absolutely crater your opinion with some of your interest groups, and it's very easy for them to start a civil war against you, the whole revolution stuff. Thankfully, you can usually crush it if you play correctly. Now, there are several other events that are unique to China. I'm not going to go through them all. I think I've covered the major problems that you might have. China is quite interesting to play. So let's talk about their alliances. So obviously you have a couple subjects, but the bigger question is, how do you gain allies and who should you ally? Well, one nation that's not bad to ally if you can pull it off is the Japanese shogunate. They tend to grow to be decently strong. The best thing you can do with them is usually get a defensive pact, which you should consider anyway. You really don't want anyone else taking over Japan because then they're right on your doorstep. That is something to consider. It's worth improving relations with them so the historical Japanese invasion of Korea and Manchuria doesn't take place during this time frame. The next nation that's a really decent ally is Russia. They're already somewhat protective towards you and your relations are cordial. You should basically do a trade agreement with them immediately. Reason being, they would be a land trade route for you rather than a sea trade route, which saves you needing convoys. Russia has a decent economy. It's smaller than yours, but it's more industrialized, meaning with the trade agreement, you can buy initial starting resources from them you might need, like tools, iron, coal, early on until you get your industry up and going, and then you can sell it to them and crush their market. Outside of that, Great Britain should have their relations with them improved immediately. You will offend them through the Opium crisis. If the events and everything work properly, they should get a lot more mad than they currently do. Suffice to say, you don't want Great Britain to invade you. Outside of that, the other great powers, France, Austria, Prussia, Spain, and the Ottomans at this point, well, Ottomans I guess technically aren't a great power at this point, will by and large leave you alone. Your biggest threat is Russia and Great Britain, so improving relations with them will keep everything nice and happy. Outside of that, many people have said in other guides that you want to establish a tributary or subject empire in Southeast Asia. I would actively urge against that. And let me explain why before all those people whose knee-jerk reaction is, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about, say. The reason is, early on, at least for the first 40 or 50 years, you're not going to have any resource shortages or a really strong army. So there's really no point to waste time and money on wars if you can avoid it. Late game, yes, you can absolutely steamroll the area, take it over, and it might be worth defending some of it. Vietnam down here in particular tends to be willing to join your custom union, which can be nice. All these nations down here, I played a whole game where I tried to peacefully add them to my custom union. It didn't work or anything, meaning war would be a thing, but if you go to war here, then you're going to trigger stuff with the Netherlands, which can trigger stuff with other people. And overall, you can get the Europeans invading you far earlier. Trying to go west has a similar problem. Yes, you can conquer some of these lands. It doesn't really gain you much. You don't need the population. There are really no resources here that you can't get on your own. Literally, the only resources you would want to invade another country for are either rubber or oil. Everything else you have, and you have in large quantities. Plus, if you expand too much this way, or ally these nations, you can run into trouble with the East India Company, which of course belongs to Great Britain, and early on has a stronger military than you. If you can do it peacefully, getting some of these, good. Be wary of sticking defensive pacts on tiny nations like Johor down here and stuff. The reality is you're going to get involved in a lot of their civil wars and rebellions more than actually defend them against Europeans. Now, the devs have said that will change as they try and make the AI a bit more aggressive in Asia. But the reality is, early on, you can't resist them with any certainty or ease. Wait till you're stronger, then you easily crush them. Okay, let's talk about the Chinese economy. So the Chinese economy at the start of the game is #1 in the world. It will not stay that way. Great Britain, France, a lot of other nations will pass you pretty quickly. Right now, France is your main economic rival. They're hoping to change that in future patches because it doesn't make sense that France dominates Great Britain so easily. If you've watched, I believe I called it my advanced industry guide, you'll know that China is quite unique in the sense that you have all the resources you need to build up a mass industrial complex pretty much in just these 3 provinces. You could theoretically just get away with these 2. I do recommend you include this 3rd just because it has access to the sea. Now, when it comes to building up the Chinese economy, there are a couple factors you need to take in mind. The first one is you have no shortage of manpower whatsoever. You have by far and away the world's largest population, and it's going to stay that way for a long time, barring migration or somebody massively reforming their healthcare system early on and you having problems. Basically, every single one of your states has about the equivalent that even the largest capitals in Europe might have. In fact, most of them have way more. Meaning you can centralize to an absurd degree. However, centralization is great, but you don't want to over-centralize. Now, some people are going to be kicking and screaming about that. Listen to my explanation first. The issue is, say something like Beijing, you can centralize this, and I'll show you an example of a very centralized Beijing later with one of my games. You can centralize this to, it's got an urban size of over 100 and stuff, and you've got amazing throughputs, bonuses, and the like. The problem is, you will very quickly overrun your infrastructure. Yes, you can build ports and railroads. The reality is you will have to be expanding a railroad to like level 50 or more just to even keep up with the demands on your infrastructure, at least until you hit electric trains technology. Once you hit electric trains, that will make things significantly easier on you, or electric railways technically. But that's years and years away from you as China. So just be aware that while you can centralize, you don't want to over-centralize. It's extraordinarily easy to do so. What you want to do is try and spread out your industry as much as you can. Now, you don't need to do some of the other strategies I've shown for smaller nations where you develop every single one of your resources early game. Yes, you can do it, and yes, it will build your economy. But early on, centralization, because you have the money and you're so large, you're not in any demand of natural resources at the beginning. So centralization is good. Later on, I'd say like 50 years in the game, then you want to expand to developing every single one of your regions. The reason you expand to develop every single one of your regions is to solve the infrastructure problem and also to reduce turmoil in those states by giving your middle and upper strata population some work to do, basically. If you don't, you'll have unrest galore in the northern Chinese lands. The other thing you need to be aware of for the economy of China, and we'll go into more buildings, is at the start of the game, you have a large amount of states up here that are not incorporated. It's worth going through and incorporating them. It will give you a boost to your economy. Now, then that leads us to the whole bureaucracy problem, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So let's get back to buildings and the economy here. So first off, I want you to go through, put your taxation level back to normal. For some reason, the game starts with low taxes and overly high government wages. Put them back to average. It'll free up, well, suffice to say, it'll free up your economy significantly. You're going to want to invest that surplus, at least early on, in construction sectors. Probably 2 to start at least, if not more. What you want to do is put all your construction sectors in Beijing to start. The reason is later on you'll be able to build a skyscraper and other stuff, and you're going to want to put those in Beijing to get the biggest bonuses for your construction. Plus, Beijing is probably going to be the area you build the most government admin buildings in. Just because it's easier there. And with the skyscraper, the bonuses can become, well, a little bit ridiculous late game, which is what you're after. And the reason you have to worry about government admin is because China has government admin problems like nobody's business. But we'll talk about that later. So what you want to do, get some building construction sectors going. Don't build too many of them. It will bankrupt you faster than anything else you could possibly do. You're going to want to start up your iron, tool, and coal engine. By which I mean you're going to want to start coal mines, you're going to want to start iron mines, and you're going to want to start tool workshops upgrades here. That's going to be the biggest engine of your growth for probably the first 30 years. Now, it's not to be said that you shouldn't build other stuff, and you definitely want to produce opium and stuff over here. China has a lot of unique modifiers which are worth looking about. Mostly some of your states through here have bonuses towards agriculture, which is obviously where you want to put your farms. Cheaper, bigger bonuses. The rest of your land tends to get bonuses towards either infrastructure, natural harbors, and the like. It can be very useful to take advantage of them. Be aware that you do have desert up here, so building an agricultural industry up here is going to be quite difficult. So, construction sectors. Now, you've got a choice here of what you want to build. I tend to start building iron mines and stuff down here in Hebei, but you can build them in Shaanxi over here. You might consider building them over here rather than in this province, because you can build deeper iron and coal mines, and as you up your throughput economy of scale, throughput economies of scale, you're going to need this level. It's extraordinarily easy to max out the iron mines and coal mines here because they're so small. These guys are nigh on infinite in terms of the game. You can run your entire industry off the coal and iron mines here. So I would recommend building at least 2 iron mines, building 2 tool workshops. Obviously, you're going to want the construction sectors followed probably by an iron, then a tool, then an iron, then a tool. Keep up that pattern for a while. 1, 2, 1. Oops, I'm on the wrong one. 2, etc. Once you get about 4 or 5 of those built, you basically want to build until those buildings stop making money upon upgrades, at which point you want to throw down coal mines. Probably about 5 to 10 to start. The reason is, once you start changing your technology, China actually has a lot of buildings and industry already set up and running, which means as soon as you start changing your manufacturing techniques, you can skyrocket your coal demands. You're going to need way more coal mines than you think. Coal is the engine of the age. Having great coal mines is going to make a difference. The other thing you need to consider early on is logging camps. And to start, it might be worth throwing down 2 in Beijing, making sure that you could even put them right after your construction sectors. Reason being, early on, when you're going to be building stuff, you're going to be using either wooden buildings, which just use fabric and wood, and something you can afford easily early on. Once you get your iron mines going, you're going to be using iron and tools to make them, and you'll gain a huge boost to your construction rate. The downside is until you build the tool factories and iron, the cost is going to be sky high. But regardless, you're still going to be using a good amount of wood, and you also have scattered throughout your lands, you have a large amount of furniture manufacturers, which you want to keep the wood cost low for so that you'll make money from them. After you get a bit of an engine going, basically until you no longer have input shortages. If you ever see you have an input shortage, you should try and adjust it immediately. But you want to try and get the cost down to maybe not average, but significantly lower than it is. You'll want to take a quick detour, probably over to Sichuan here, and throw down, assuming you've ended the opium crisis, probably about 5 to 10 opium plantations, and it might even be worth throwing down one of all your agriculture here and here and here, all states that have agricultural throughput modifiers. The reason is, at some point, you're going to want to make almost everything auto-constructed, so having those in place early on will help. You also need to go through and address your production techniques at China. At the beginning, China's production techniques are terrible. Your wheat farms here, I recommend probably throwing it to either vineyards or citrus orchards. In the long run, citrus orchards are going to be more beneficial because they bring in sugar. And surprisingly, you don't actually have access to sugar plantations as China. And late game, there are several buildings that like you to have sugar, like grocery manufacturing buildings, food industries. Harvesting tools, same thing here. Basically, sawmills here, and that, just like that, we've reformed all of that. In terms of your urban centers, you start with market squares. It's worth leaving it there. Once you start to get coal coming in, and you'll need a ton of coal, because look how big that deficit is, you're going to want to swap to gas streetlights, which will make a huge difference only once you can afford it. Elsewhere, most of your production techniques are already good. You're going to want to keep upgrading them as time goes on. There is no province in China that I'm aware of that gives you an electricity modifier or anything. Centralizing is good, but there is limits to your economy of scale early on, as well as the infrastructure problem I already mentioned. Early on, you can only build to level 20 and get a plus 20 economy of scale throughput bonus. Then it'll extend to 30, then to 50, which means building above 50, or 20 or 30, depending on what level you are, is not as beneficial as starting to build again someplace else. Now, obviously, that changes if you're about to research expansion tech that allows higher economy of scale. It's good to do those when you get them, which means once you build government admin, let's use an example, is 20 here. It does not make any sense to go beyond like 21 to get a throughput. Then it's worth building up this to 20, then building this to 20. That will give you your largest benefits towards, say, your bureaucracy. As that expands, things change. At some point, and I would say that's around when you have about 400 construction, you'll run across the problems that even if you automate your industry, you can only upgrade your industry so fast. And this is important, especially if you want to get the 1 billion GDP achievement as China, which is really easy. You're going to have the problem that you can only upgrade the buildings so fast with the auto upgrades. If you run across that situation, build elsewhere. That's the point at which you want to build every single one of your resources and agriculture buildings to build up. Go through, make sure every state has stuff, has some industry. The industries you're probably going to run across a shortage of, which I did, was power plants. You're going to need a massive amount of electricity as time goes on. Getting a power plant in every single Chinese state, if you turn on auto upgrades, will allow it to upgrade like 20 or 30 rather than 1. Wait till it fills up, upgrade again. Auto construction is great. It does run across problems once you hit high levels and face massive shortages. Tooling workshops is another you're going to need everywhere. Same thing with steel mills, and to a large degree, motor industries. I think in one of my games, I had 3 provinces with more than level 50 motor industries, and I was still having motor shortages. It's not a bad idea as China to build factories in advance of you using them, considering how big you are. Changing your production methods, especially ones that associate with like urban center or POPs demands, unless you already have an infrastructure set up in place to accommodate that change, it will just crash your economy. It's not unusual to go from 150K income to negative 200K loss. And that is especially a key when it comes to your military. And we'll take a sidetrack here. You start off with a regular infantry and no artillery. At the start of the game, you're going to want to switch to cannon artillery, even if you can't really afford it, just to survive the opium crisis. The difference between having this on and not is 10 offense, defense, morale, and kill rate, as well as army power projection. If you turn it on, I've never seen Great Britain ever attack China. Your first technology along that same line should probably be mandatory service, followed immediately by line infantry. So if you do get in a war, you'll have at least decent troops. However, China starts off with 445 battalions, which is huge. It's one of the largest armies in the game at the start. You're not going to be able to afford constantly upgrading your military. By that I mean, don't switch to line infantry unless you feel that you're going to get attacked, because 48k is huge. You're going to want to build up a arms industry in one of your provinces. Probably build it to level 20 almost immediately, obviously take into account changing circumstances. Just so that you can support your military at war. You're going to have trouble importing enough arms to support your army, especially if you move from irregular troops. Meaning mostly China plays as if they're like Japan, isolationist. Yes, you can trade and you should trade, but by and large, you have everything you need to build up internally, and you're going to want to build up internally because at some point you have to use the diplomatic play, force recognition on a great power, which means you have to win a war against them, which is, well, suffice to say, rather difficult. The best solution I've had for force recognition is wait till the great power falls into either a civil war or a rebellion or World War I, basically, and then do a diplomatic play against them. In 2 of my games, Great Britain collapsed into a republic, and as soon as it started collapsing, I started a diplomatic play for recognition, called in my ally Russia, which tends to be your best ally as China, and they backed down. I became a great power, number 1 in the world, with no war. Otherwise, the war is going to rage over India, East India Company. Great Britain is the best one to force recognition from because you have this nice long front here and you can get a lot of kills and occupy land that way. Outside of that, it's kind of hard because you have to actually reach them, for which you need a larger navy. You have a 15 navy. You're going to want to build that higher just so that you can do invasions. If you do have to invade, the AI sucks at handling naval invasions, so it's not overwhelmingly hard. So let's take the time now to look at technology. I don't usually do technology for nations, but China is key here. So first off, mandatory service into line infantry. You just want to do it to make sure that you actually have decent troops. Otherwise, using irregular infantry is just pretty much a disaster. You're not going to win any real substantial wars with irregulars, barring invasions. And with how warfare functions, stronger army almost always wins, even if it's smaller. After you do that, you've got several things to consider. You could do some push into society. Specifically, central archives is very useful. See how large it is, though, so it's not going to be your first option. Something like stock exchange, currency standards are all really good. Those would be the ones I would say to focus on first. While it is great to think, oh, I can build a health system or an education system as China, the reality is you can't afford it. Because if you look over here, it'll be close to 400 pretty quickly. Your bureaucracy cost is massive, mainly due to the fact that you're spending 11k already on just your population, let alone bureaucracy. You can get pretty much one institution for most of the game, unless you go absolutely not building government admin buildings, in which case be careful, because they are expensive to maintain. You have several choices what institutions you want. The one I recommend the most is dedicated police force. The real reason here is no police is hated by everybody. Local police force supports the landowners, who are your main problem to modernizing your country. Dedicated police force reduces radicals and state penalties for turmoil, which is something you're going to see as time goes on, making it one of the best institutions to use. Schools, healthcare sound great. The reality is healthcare is not needed. You have such a huge population, and schools While it's great, you're almost better off just building a university in every single one of your provinces to build up. And that's something to consider in terms of technology anyway. You're going to want to build a university, probably Beijing. Depends where you want to stick it. Beijing, I recommend to be the central of your industry because it's your capital. And as a result, is really good to have as your capital. You're going to want to build it up, and getting to a level 20 or 21 university will give you the most tech pops possible. You have a huge population here that can be educated. You start with 22% education, which is reasonably decent, but you'll very quickly hit the point where your population is not literate enough for you to generate more technology. That's not a bad thing because it goes into your technology spread here, unspent innovation, which will help you spread technologies. So as China, it is worth getting a huge university or even 2 huge university centers going, and then focus on researching higher tech with them and letting the excess spread get you all the cheap techs. So the only ones here I might recommend would be something like currency standards leading into banking, central archives, and central banking early on. Later on, you're going to want to get steel frame buildings and modern sewage, but that's a ways away. Outside of that, I would ignore all of this. Yes, you could try and colonize as China. The reality is the only thing you'd want to colonize is rubber plantations, really, and sugar. By the time you get there, though, it's going to be difficult to be productive, and you've got better uses for your tech time. Outside of military, once you get line infantry, ignore it. You'll get most of these from institution spread. Do not waste any time whatsoever researching naval technologies. It's entirely useless as China. The odds of you are being attacked rather than attacking, making the Navy almost useless because the people you'll be attacking have a stronger Navy regardless. Which means all your focus really should be on your production. Start with cotton gin into lathe. Then get atmospheric engines for the huge boost to your production of your mines. This is where you're going to see a huge demand for coal and tools, which is why I started you there initially. Jump to an intensive agriculture. Make sure you switch to these, especially the intensive grazing on livestock, because that's how you're going to get early game fertilizer. Further on, you'll kind of have a feeling of where to go. I do recommend getting Bessemer process and nitroglycerin followed by dynamite reasonably early. That will increase your steel production. This will increase your mining, as well as your death rate of your population working there. Dynamite will solve most of them, as well as boost a huge amount of your production for your mines, as well as give you vacuum evaporation for your chemical plants, which for those of you who don't know, your chemical plants is how you're going to generate fertilizer and explosives. So once you get Bessemer or whatever, you're definitely going to have to build chemical buildings, followed by munition, blah, 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 to support your arms. Buildings I don't recommend you build super early on is an arts academy. You can build them. They're less than useful. At some point, food industries is worth building. You can build it super high. It gives you a lot of money early on. Just be careful of building too many early on. I made that mistake in one run. And the problem was, yes, it's very beneficial for your industry, but it also raises the price of your staple goods, forcing you to spend more time building your agriculture rather than your heavy industry. At some point, you're going to be able to build everything and keep building construction sectors. Basically, if you are green and you're making, I'd say 60K, build 2 to 3 construction sectors. If at all you go negative, just pause or keep an eye on that. You have an absolutely massive gold reserve, as well as access to some gold mines up here in outer Manchuria at some point. So you should make some decent money. In terms of your laws, you have serfdom enabled initially, and serfdom, I won't say is the worst thing. The problem is it gives your landowners a massive amount of political strength and should be one of the first things you try and get rid of. You're going to need to put one of these groups in power. The literati are really good to boost anyhow because they help with reforms. especially if you're trying to get rid of the empire. Right now, it's not really worth keeping the emperor in place. As time goes on, the devs are going to change it so more conservative, monarchical, authoritarian governments have more loyalty from their populations, at which point it might be worth keeping them. But for now, get rid of serfdom when you can. So let's talk about what other laws are good. Thankfully, slavery is banned, which helps a lot. Outside of this, human rights, change serfdom, maybe change child labor and legal guardianship of women late game. Otherwise, ignore this tree. In terms of power structure, you have monarchy. Abolishing the monarchy will cause immense havoc and can easily start a revolution. It's not going to be something you can do for a long time. Distribution of power. If you can, you're going to want to change from an autocracy, which gives huge political strength to the aristocrats, towards landed voting. Most people criticize my recommendation of this change. It is good. It causes parties to emerge. It does boost officers, clergymen, and capitalists who are not necessarily your landholder populations. If you look at who's part of this, yes, it gives clergy and aristocrats support. It doesn't include all the other populations. Yes, somewhat officers, but it does weaken them because you're more likely to see your officer strength in terms of your army. Your armed forces, they tend to end up down here more than anything else. Servicemen, officers, engineers, capitalists, they all end up supporting the armed forces, which, in my opinion, does in the long run weaken your landed people as well. Plus, it introduces political parties. Later on, trying to get towards wealth voting is not necessarily the best idea. I recommend census suffrage. You can usually ram it through. Once you do that, passing laws gets way easier. You start with appointed bureaucrats, leave that as is. Peasant levies is an interesting one here. You're going to want to reform to a professional army as soon as you can. Assuming you did landed voting, you'll see that your armed forces get a huge boost. Put them in your government. You can usually ram through this law, which will give your armed forces a huge boost in political strength, as well as reduce landowner strength considerably. This is important because it limits the highest level of infantry troops you can produce, especially for conscripts. I don't recommend having the best conscripts unless you're at war because it just cripples your economy. Outside of that, home affairs is nice to put on. Don't put it on until you have a 5K surplus of bureaucracy, which is going to happen so rarely it's barely worth mentioning. But outside of the police, home affairs, internal security, probably National Guard or secret police would be the one I recommend over education or healthcare, or especially Social Security. Don't ever pass Social Security here. The welfare payments and stuff will just kill you. It's really quite painful. Outside of that, you need to change away from traditionalism. In order to change away from it, you really do need to have to weaken your landholders and everything. Being aware that as soon as you change from traditionalism, the population cost, which is already 11K for these guys, you're going to see the bureaucracy cost rise 25%. So 2,000 or more. So make sure you have a surplus before you pass the law. The game will tell you if you're going to run short on admin. It doesn't tell you how much you're going to run short on admin, which can come quite as a surprise. You'll probably get intervention or agrarianism early on, which is great because then you start to get the investment pool going. At some point, you'll have such a large investment pool that it will fund most of your construction, which is ideal. Once you can, you're going to want to reform land-based taxation to either per capita, ideally proportional, but per capita is better than anything else. The loss here will change as different groups gain more money. Don't go to consumption-based, even though it does decrease the bureaucracy. It's just really not worth it. Outside of that, mercantilism, you can just sit on this for the whole game. Protectionism's okay. At some point, free trade is decent. Be wary of building too many trade routes because they cost bureaucracy. Free trade helps with that a bit. Don't build too many. Outside of that, if you want to colonize, you have to research colonialization and pass one of these laws. Anyway, that was what I wanted to show you. Now, how about we go over and look at one of my more recent games is these guys. And you can see the sheer might of China when it's fully realized. Hey, here we are. It's 1920. China is now blue. It is a democratic republic. Here's the various laws we have. Intervention, free trade, per capita, parliamentary republic. It was just the only one I passed. Presidential would have been fine as well. National Guard, professional army, police force. We did manage to pass the education system, but it is massive. You'll see the population at this point is 18K just from bureaucracy. Partially that's from changing your economic system. Also just general growth, trying to pass women, stuff like that. Government, institutions, yeah. Technology, you can see that we are the dominant technological force at this point. Outside of, obviously, we've neglected Navy and Army to some degree. The big one here to grab is trench works late game. If you can, get to tanks, but trench works just makes it almost impossible to beat you at war. Most nations don't hit trench infantry until about this time frame, and even then it'll only be great powers, meaning everyone else, easy to conquer. In terms of society, you'll see we've gone all the way down here. All these problems. First off, let's wander down here. Heavenly Kingdom never fired for us in this game because I didn't have any states with Protestantism. If you were expanding, that would be a problem. Here's how you have to stamp out monarchism. We're doing fine at this point. We did have a bit of a civil war, and I can show you what happened to our economy at that point. Suffice to say, we hit about 1 billion around between 1900 and 1910. It was really easy to hit. Our economy is equivalent to, well, basically everybody else's. Like, it's like the top 5 great powers, 5 or 6 great powers barely equal our economy. And as you can see, we're going straight up after the war. It wasn't overwhelmingly hard, the war. I just massed tons of barracks in Beijing and troops, and basically the whole south of China revolted on me, and I had to win with the north. I was allied to Russia, Japan, obviously Tibet. All told, I won the war. It just took a while. The casualties were like, oof. Well, doesn't truly show it, but like 1 million people died or more, all told in the war. It was pretty brutal. Now, you'll see here that we have an insane amount of construction. I haven't personally ordered a build at all in 10 years. I'm literally just letting the economy run it. We've literally started every single resource building we have is being built. Agricultural. Honestly, the game is starting to hit throughput economy of scale just by letting it run itself. It's developed these productivities all the way up without me actually doing anything. Here's Beijing, by the way, 113 urban size, motor industry is 54, government admin 155. Reason being, skyscrapers here boost the throughput of your admin buildings, which means your biggest amount of administration should be where you're going to stick your skyscraper, which is Beijing in this case. Forbidden City is kind of a nice little bonus, but it's really not that useful. Level 50 in university. Here's what I was talking about by the innovation problem. Yes, we're producing a mass amount of innovation, but it's capped from the literacy, which we've only gotten to 40. On the other hand, our technology spread is quite large. We're getting most of the minor techs just from spreading technology. Universities. Power here. 525 units, which is equivalent to basically everybody else. There's the British Republic. The only person who could theoretically meet us in unit size is Russia, but the reality is Russia is still on peasant levies, meaning we could absolutely crush them. At this point, if we wanted to, we could go and start pushing for the Western Protectorate, Treaty Port in France, Germany, British Isles, Iberia, and Italy. we could probably pull it off. We can fight most of the world. We'd have to build a navy. That's pretty much it. The only thing that's worth mentioning is we've got Vietnam, Kokand, and Bukhara, I think, in our customs union. And outside of that, China, Japan haven't really done anything. It's, at this point, it's so easy for us to have become the great power. It's almost ridiculous. Our GDP passed France's ages ago. And we're only going to get larger. That's how you play China. It's not really that hard. Just remember coal, iron, tools early on. Then at some point build stuff like opium and stuff. I think the game has built 69 opium plantations here because it's so profitable for us. It's funny, China, crippled by opium at the beginning, becomes the opium producer of the world later. And basically, we've got all the automation, trains, everything else. If you look here, you can see why we're having infrastructure problems. 900. Until we did the electric trains here, we were massively below on infrastructure. And if you're low on infrastructure, it causes tons of problems. So try to avoid it. Don't centralize as much as I did here in Beijing. It's really not worth it. Spread your industry out more. I had to do it. I basically stuck my industry in like these provinces here. Early on, coast is good because you get a bonus towards infrastructure for being coastal. Later on, though, just go everywhere. Make sure you build a railroad in every single one of your provinces. Put it all to auto upgrade, and it solves most of your infrastructure issues. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully this helps you play China more. If you have any questions, let me know. This will be my 5th game as these guys, and this is the best strategy I've worked out for laws and industry. So hopefully it helps you. If you did enjoy it, please do like, subscribe, all that, and I will see you all in another guide, let's play, or live stream. Bye for now.